Up until last week, it seemed unthinkable for a UN member state to strike a nuclear facility, but Israel did just that when it launched its first attack on Tehran, hitting military and nuclear sites and residential buildings where key figures from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, lived and died. It also seemed unthinkable for missiles to penetrate Israel's Iron Dome and destroy infrastructure in key cities like Haifa and Tel Aviv. As in most cases, civilians are the ones paying the heaviest price. More than 240 people have been killed in Tehran so far, and in Israel, at least 24 people were killed in the retaliatory strikes. As Israel and Iran threaten each other with annihilation, US President Donald Trump has given conflicting messages. On the one hand, he has promised a ceasefire, and on the other, he's signaling his country's readiness to bomb Iran alongside Israel. But an official decision has not come out of the White House yet. Israel and Iran, of course, don't exist in isolation. A sense of dread looms in the region, and a group of 20 countries, including Gulf states, Jordan, and Egypt, have collectively called for de-escalation and an end to hostilities. This comes at a time of heightened tensions across the Middle East already. They fear the repercussions for them will just be too catastrophic, both militarily and politically. Israel, Iran, the Arab states, the US, and beyond. Much of what we're seeing here is unprecedented. So what can be done to end this war, and what happens if Tehran falls? This is Beyond the Headlines, and I'm your host, Nada Al-Tahir. In this episode, we examine the impact of the Israel-Iran war on the Middle East, and we ask, in the worst-case scenario, what consequences should the region be ready for? With things changing from minute to minute, it's difficult to predict exactly what comes next. For countries in the region, this volatility has made an already dire situation even more challenging. I speak to Hassan Al-Hassan, Senior Fellow for Middle East Policy at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. I discuss with him the potential outcomes of this war and what it means for the Middle East. Israel's strikes and Iran's retaliation are, to say the least, unwanted by governments in the region. Did we see this coming? Was there an expectation that we would ever reach this point this soon?
Yeah, I fully agree. I don't think anyone here in the region, especially among the Arab Gulf states, wanted this war. And in fact, we would be well advised to remember that they were actively involved in trying to avert it. And so the Saudis had dispatched the defense minister, Prince Khalid bin Salman, with a message to the supreme leader of Iran back in April saying, please sign this deal with Donald Trump, or otherwise there is a heightened risk of strikes by Benjamin Netanyahu. Keep in mind that there is obviously very little sympathy for the Iranian regime in the Gulf, but still no one wants to live in a free-for-all where Israel essentially gets to strike whomever it wants, whenever it wants, with no regard for international law whatsoever. I think to see how Israel's military campaign against Iran, whose objectives have very quickly metastasized from eliminating Iran's nuclear and missile programs to overthrowing regime, ends well for Iran's Arab Gulf neighbors. Could we have seen this coming? I think to some extent, yes. To the extent that the Saudis, for example, as I mentioned, were actively warning the Iranians back in April that this was a heightened possibility. In a sense, I think we were caught off guard to some extent because of the fact that the nuclear talks with Iran were still ongoing. But in the grand scheme of things, I think there was a broad awareness that an Israeli strike on Iran was a very significant possibility. I think what threw us off was the precise timing of it.
The dangers to the region are so many, from attacks on foreign military bases to misfired missiles or falling debris like we've seen in Jordan, and obviously the greatest threat of all, which is nuclear contamination. Are we expecting to see things escalate to that point, or do you think this will all be over before any of that happens?
We can't rule anything out at this stage. I mean, there are obviously a number of second-order consequences that are of direct relevance to the Arab Gulf states. If Iran's energy infrastructure, its oil terminals, were to be severely damaged by Israeli strikes along the coast of the Gulf, then we could be looking at potential oil spills in the Gulf. Those could be very challenging for maritime navigation, for water desalination. And essentially, if you have issues with water desalination, then that's obviously drinking water gets affected, but so does power generation industry and everything. Now, this is not the first time we've seen massive oil spills in the Gulf in the past, in both instances as a result of conflict. So in 1983, Saddam Hussein struck Iranian oil terminals, resulting in a very large oil spill. In 1991, he did it again with Kuwait, and that again resulted in one of the largest oil spills in history. There are obviously risks there. If Bushehr, Iran's nuclear reactor, were to be affected, then obviously that could also pose contamination risks for the Arab Gulf states. And the escalation risks are obviously on the table. I mean, I don't see it as being in Iran's calculated strategic interest to strike at US bases, but in a final act of desperation, the Iranians could lash out. They could do that. They could target Gulf energy infrastructure. They could seek to close down the Strait of Hormuz. Now, I think the Americans and their partners in the region, be they the Arab Gulf states, the Brits, the French, are, I think, very well equipped to deal with those escalatory scenarios and situations. But there's no denying that there's going to be a real severe effect, I think, on people and livelihoods in the region in the meantime.
You mentioned the West being prepared, but are the Arabs prepared to absorb such attacks if they do escalate? And are there any measures in place?
We've seen the Arab Gulf states take measures to ensure adequate food and water security. Now, there are vulnerabilities, and we're right to focus on them. So, for example, Saudi Arabia and Oman have desalination plants in the Red Sea and the Arabian Sea, respectively. The rest of the Gulf states don't. And so, Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, for example, are extremely dependent on desalinated water from the Gulf, the UAE to a very large extent also. And the Gulf states don't have the same kind of civil defense preparedness that the Israelis have, hardened shelters and whatnot. But the Arabian Peninsula is a large region. It has multiple points of access. And so the ability to ensure national resilience with countries that are financially well endowed, that have very developed logistical civil aviation capabilities. We've seen a dry run of this during the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, when the Gulf states were, despite not having a very large pharmaceutical industry or, were still among the best prepared countries in the world. We should also keep in mind, I think, not just the vulnerabilities, but also the strengths and assets of the Arab Gulf states. So I think in case the situation were to spiral and Iran were to target Arab Gulf interests, then, let's keep in mind that the Arab Gulf states would also be able to defend themselves and also be able to respond should they need to.
So what's the end game here? You mentioned this earlier. Is it regime change? And if that happens, what does that mean for the region? How does that change the checks and balances of the region?
It's terrible because, in a sense, there are multiple sinister parallels with the 2003 Iraq War, and they're very difficult to miss. I mean, you have essentially an illegal aggression carried out under false pretenses with apparently the objective of regime change. And we all remember how the Iraq War turned out, and no one that I know of considers that war to have been successful in any respect or for its outcomes to have been net positive for the region. It's very difficult to see any of the likely outcomes of this war being net positive for the Arab Gulf states. If we end up with regime change in Iran, then there's no guarantee that we wouldn't end up with a more militant and radical successor. The IRGC is still the most organized and potent military force of the country. And with its senior leadership wiped out, you could very well see more radicalized militant elements of the IRGC assuming control. And unlike the current Iranian configuration, they might not necessarily put the same value on maintaining positive relationships with Iran's Arab Gulf neighbors and essentially might upend years of diplomatic work and de-escalation. You could also simultaneously end up seeing a fractured and divided Iran, where Iran could end up being divided along ethnic lines, along geographical lines. And obviously, I think a chaotic, unstable Iran, where the state no longer has central control over UAV stocks, over missile stocks, CBRN, chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear program stocks. I think that's really bad news. And I don't think anyone would be looking forward to seeing a failed state along the Arab Gulf states' eastern flank.
There have been reports, suspicions, beliefs that the US might get involved, even though it already said it won't. If it does, what does that mean for not just Iran, but also the Arab states, which are closely allied with the US?
It's quite difficult to take anything that comes out of the US very seriously at the moment because it changes every 5 minutes. One day, President Trump seems to be calling for de escalation in talks and offering a deal. The next day, he seems to demand nothing less than total surrender and capitulation. The issue, I think, is that if the US does get involved, then there's a significant likelihood that Iran would retaliate by targeting US bases, assets, and infrastructure in the Gulf. All of the 6 Gulf states have US military forces or US military installations or bases of some description. The issue to keep in mind is that Iranian missiles and UAVs aren't, and particularly missiles, aren't necessarily always accurate. And so the possibility that projectiles fired at US bases could end up hitting civilian areas or critical infrastructure in the Gulf states is also very much a likelihood. I don't think this is a scenario that Iran wants. I don't think Iran will actively try and involve the United States or drag them into this war. I think the more likely scenario is that the US decides that it has to go in and strike the highly hardened facility at Fordo to eliminate, or at least get as close to eliminating Iran's nuclear program as possible. I think that's the more likely scenario, and I don't see that scenario resulting in any good outcomes for the Iranian regime.
What do we make of the situation with Iran and its proxies? The Houthis have been trying to strike Israel and have been striking Israel. Hezbollah has been really quiet. What happens to these proxies if Iran fails, if Iran falls? What happens to these proxies? Do they become rogue actors? Do they cease to exist? What happens to them?
We tend to be myopically focusing on the current conflict, but let's keep in mind and let's remember that this is part of a much broader and wider military campaign that Israel has launched against Iran and its armed non-state actors in the region in the aftermath of October 2023. If you look at the broad sequencing of events, Israel has worked its way from the outside in. And so it has already, figurative sense, chopped off Iran's arms in Lebanon, in Syria, and in Gaza as well with Hamas. And so I think it's quite obvious that these armed non-state groups are already highly isolated. Hezbollah is very much isolated from its traditional supply routes, from its strategic depth. And I think that if Iran does fall, then obviously these groups are going to be, I think, in a much more difficult situation. Now, their local contexts will matter. And so I don't think that we can make a necessarily definitive judgment across the board. The situation in Iraq and the way that the popular PMF forces are embedded in Iraqi society is quite different to the way that the Ansarullah or the Houthis in Yemen are. And the situation again is different with Hezbollah. So I think local circumstances will matter. But I think to my mind, it's fairly clear that if the Iranian regime does go down, then essentially these groups will lose their most significant source of support, and I think will probably face a much more difficult time maintaining the power or influence or control that they have been able to exert over their societies so far.
How influential are the Arab states in all of this? Are they actually able to make an impact at all?
I doubt that Gulf offers of mediation will be taken up at this stage. Israel is clearly in no mood for compromise, and Trump really seems unlikely to exert any pressure over Netanyahu to engage in talks at this stage. I think, having established almost complete freedom of action over Iranian skies, I would suspect that Israel, which exerts greater control over the tempo of the fighting, will undoubtedly seize the opportunity to eliminate what it regards as its most significant threat. And I don't see any offer of mediation, be it from the Gulf states or elsewhere, really putting a dent into that strategy. The Arab Gulf states placed massive bets on Trump as being peacemaker, taking his campaign promises of bringing an end to conflict in the region quite seriously. Now, I think, let's be honest, bet has flopped. And Trump, like his predecessor Biden, has proved either unwilling or incapable or both of restraining Israel.
What about Tehran's calculus in this war? Israel struck only days before the 6th round of nuclear negotiations was set to take place between the US and Iran in Oman. These conversations have now been put on hold indefinitely. Instead, Iran has found itself embroiled in war. The question is, what is its strategy now, and how can it hit the brakes on its regime being toppled? To talk more about this, I'm joined by Thomas Junot, Associate Fellow with the MENA program at Chatham House and a professor at the University of Ottawa. This time around, when Israel struck Iran, there was perhaps a very brief moment where everyone thought, or wondered at least if Iran would respond, but it didn't take long for Iran to retaliate. Did Iran actually have any other choice but to respond the way that it did against Israel?
Well, when Israel struck Iran a few days ago, Iran faced a really difficult dilemma because by not responding or by responding only on a small and limited scale, Iran would have projected a signal of weakness. It would have projected a signal of weakness to its own population, which as a dictatorship it did not want to do. It would have sent a signal of weakness to Israel and the US, and especially so because Israel had so clearly signaled in the first hours when it started last week that it was going to continue. Israel was absolutely going to continue in Iran, striking Iran, independent of what Iran did to some extent. So from Iran's perspective, not responding would have invited Israel to continue without any opposition. That being said, the dilemma for Iran was that if it did respond the way it did, it knew that Israel would respond to the response. And if there's anything that we learned from the two instances of direct confrontation between Iran and Israel in 2024, in April and October, it's that Israel dominated. It's that Israel has much more offensive firepower than Iran, and that Israel has much better defenses than Iran. And Iran knows this. Iran's ability to hurt Israel is limited, and Israel's ability to hurt Iran is very high. And that puts Iran in a very difficult position.
What is Tehran's calculation in this war? Is this just a show of force for now that Iran believes is going to end with talks or diplomatically, or is this an existential moment for Iran where it thinks or believes that, it's do or die, basically?
Well, the question of the objective of Israel and possibly the US is a really important one. Is it actually regime change or not? And I'm not sure what the answer to that question is. Would Israel, in a theoretical way, want to see the Islamic Republic fall? Absolutely. But that's not the same question as saying, is Israel doing everything that it needs to do now to get the Islamic Republic's regime to fall? A preference and an actual substantial policy are not the same thing. So from Iran's perspective, what is its intent now? It is starting to be existential. My assessment is that the Islamic Republic is not about to fall, at least not in an imminent way, but the pressure on it is certainly as high as it's ever been since the worst days of the Iran-Iraq war in the 1980s. And we might get into a point where it's worse. So yes, we are getting pretty close to existential territory for the Islamic Republic.
What happens if Iran falls? What happens if the regime is toppled?
The first point that I'd say is that making predictions about the fall of regimes is extraordinarily difficult. So I find that any discussion on this issue always has to start with a point of view of humility. The second point that I'd make is that at this point, I do not assess that the Islamic Republic is close to collapsing. It is under tremendous pressure, but it retains very strong repressive capacity. Police, secret services, security services, which retain the ability to instill fear in the population. Even though its geopolitical posture is extraordinarily suffering, its repressive capacity domestically remains strong. Because of that, it retains an ability to survive. The Islamic Republic is widely unpopular inside Iran, but it does retain a narrow base of support, and that can be enough for it to retain power. Then the question becomes, but what if analysts who predict that its fall is not imminent are wrong, which is entirely possible, and the Islamic Republic collapses soon? There are multiple scenarios. One of them is a takeover by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and Iran goes from a theocracy to some form of military dictatorship.
But would Israel and the US want that to happen? Would they allow that to happen? Because that kind of defeats the purpose of this whole thing.
I don't think the US and Israel are in a position to prevent that from happening. Israel and the US do not have significant influence on the ground inside Iran in terms of shaping political developments. Another scenario, in the case of the Islamic Republic's collapse, which is also not a fun scenario, is basically a complete collapse of order. And there would be no successor government in any formal sense, whether a military dictatorship, a democracy, or anything else. Iran is a country of 90 million. It is a large country, not only physically, but in terms of its diversity. Almost half of the population are minorities. There is significant discontent, especially in peripheral areas. So you can see scenarios which are extraordinarily difficult for Iran's neighbors, where the collapse of the Islamic Republic leads to a possibly long-term collapse of order. The third scenario that a lot of people on the outside are hoping for in Israel and the US, but also obviously inside Iran, is a successor government to the Islamic Republic that would be a nicer government in terms of its foreign policy, in terms of its perhaps as a democracy. The problem with that scenario is that it's not very likely. at least for now, because there is no democratic opposition inside Iran, obviously, because any attempt at organizing an opposition inside Iran has been systematically repressed brutally. Outside of Iran, the opposition in exile is extraordinarily fragmented. It has been spending more time fighting each other than actually organizing against the regime. So there is no government in exile ready to take over when the Islamic Republic falls. So this can easily become a risky scenario.
What happens to the non-state actors that are bolstered by Iran? Do they kind of fall to the wayside and disappear, or do they, fend for themselves, becoming even more dangerous given that they're not operating under any sort of umbrella? What happens to them?
In the scenario that the Islamic Republic does not fall, its axis of resistance, right? The network of non-state actors that it supports throughout the region, Hamas, Hezbollah, groups in Iraq, the Houthis, will remain extraordinarily important. And I do expect that whatever happens when the dust settles in the coming weeks, Iran will try to rebuild the axis of resistance, because as weakened as the axis has been, it remains absolutely essential for Iran. So I do expect that Iran will try to rebuild that. One point that is especially interesting is the Houthis, right? Hamas and Hezbollah have been seriously weakened by Israel. So has Iran. The Houthis are the exception. The Houthis are on the rise. The Houthis are increasingly powerful, not only in Yemen, but regionally. They have become a regional power now. So from their perspective, what does it mean that Iran has been weakened so much? Does it mean that they will become more autonomous vis-a-vis Iran? The Houthis are not a proxy of Iran. If you define the term proxy as a puppet, right? The Houthis were never a puppet of Iran that would just execute Iranian orders. They were always fiercely autonomous, but they would work very closely with Iran. Now, to me, one scenario that we could see in the future is the Houthis becoming not only even more autonomous vis-a-vis Iran, because they are very well entrenched in northwest Yemen, is that the Houthis become much more aggressive. This is a radical group in many ways, and seeing Iran weaken, that they would become much more risk tolerant in terms of their aggressiveness relative to a much weakened Iran that would become more cautious as a regional actor.
The very precise timing of Israel's strike. US President Donald Trump had given the Iranians 60 days to sign a nuclear agreement. On the 61st day, Israel attacked. The US said it was not involved, but it seems too perfectly timed to be a coincidence. What do you think of this whole thing?
The exact role of the US and the discussions in private between Israel and the US in the days leading to the start of Israel's strikes on Iran a few days ago, it remains a bit of a mystery. One scenario is that the Trump administration had, in private, though not in public, abandoned the prospect of successful nuclear talks with Iran and had therefore given a de facto green light. But I don't think we know that for a fact, at least as the public. There is another scenario where the Trump administration had not completely abandoned the prospects of successful nuclear talks with Iran, even if Trump had been starting to show signs of impatience. But that's Trump, right? He always shows signs of impatience. And that Israel basically attacked before the US had formally given a green light, and against the wishes, at least at that point, of the US. Look at Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State and National Security Advisor's statement a couple hours after Israel started its strikes. Rubio's initial statement, which was the first official reaction by the US, was very cold. It clearly sought to distance itself from Israel, not opposing the strikes, but not overtly supporting them. So the bottom line to me is that publicly, I'm still not sure what exactly the US's role was. What is clear, though, is that once Israel started attacking, the US became fully on board, period.
Trump comes up with a statement almost every day now, multiple times a day, sometimes mixed messages. The last one being,
you don't know that I'm going to even do it. You don't know. I may do it. I may not do it. I mean, nobody knows what I'm going to do.
But before that, he called for Iran to completely surrender. Will Iran actually do that?
Iran will not completely surrender. The Islamic Republic absolutely hates to be perceived as capitulating under pressure, as making concessions under pressure. So exactly what is the off-ramp now? I'm not sure. I think Israel first will keep on bombing, so there will not be an off-ramp at least for a few more days, if not weeks. But at some point, there will be a slowdown in military operations, perhaps, by the way, because weapons stockpiles on both sides will become dangerously low. Iran's stock of ballistic missiles is falling, and Israel's stock of interceptor missiles for its air defenses is also falling. So that might be what gets both sides to slow down. And then there will be a bit of time, and Iran will negotiate, and Iran will make concessions because it is in such a difficult position. But A, it will not surrender. I mean, that will not happen. And B, Iran will really spend a huge amount of energy not to be perceived as surrendering or capitulating. So it will drag out negotiations and so on.
That's it for Beyond the Headlines this week. Follow our live blog on this and more at thenationalnews.com for up-to-date developments on the Israel-Iran conflict. This episode was produced by Ban Barqawi, audio engineered by Arthur Edison. Du'a Farid is our editor, and I'm your host, Nada Al-Tahir. But one more thing before you go, we do want to hear from you. Help us improve our podcast by taking our 2-minute listener survey. You can find the link in the episode's show notes. Thank you for listening.